We're going to start with opening prayer. I'd like to ask Chief Douglas White and Geraldine to please come up.
I'd say more. I'd say more. I'd say more. Quas mihi eho nitna sali zitzatamach nitna tamoch.
Greatest Creator, today we gather once again, great Creator, raising our hands, thanking you for the beautiful journey that you placed us through, thanking you for the energy that you placed within each and every one of us, great Creator, thanking you for that light that you shine on our path, ensuring that our safety to and from is there. Today I ask you, great Creator, to bless each and every one here today. Embrace those who are to speak, that their mind and their heart are connected as one, great Creator, so the words can be heard and shared amongst everyone. With that, great Creator, I thank you for being here. Haichika.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome again to the second day of this conference. I hope everyone had a good rest and is ready for another full and rich day. I was reminded yesterday in listening to the different presentations and the dialogue that was going on of an experience that Chief White and I had about a year ago. I think it was around this month, a year ago, where it's in a totally different context, but I think relates certainly to the work of our speaker this morning, but also much of our discussion yesterday. Chief White and I were in Boston, Massachusetts, speaking together at a conference about race relations and racial unity. And as part of that, we were taken on a tour of the downtown area of Boston, of what's called the African American History Trail. And for those of you who know United States history, of course, Boston's the home of the more famous trail, the Freedom Trail, the birthplace of American democracy. And it's a very interesting thing. Thousands of people go on that Freedom Trail every day. There's thousands of people walking it. And then there's this African American History Trail that goes in almost the same neighborhood, but the two trails never meet. They never intersect. And Chief White and I spoke with the curator of the African American History Museum that manages that trail, and she said for 30 years they've been negotiating with those, it's the National Park Service, who run the Freedom Trail to intersect the two trails. Because, of course, the histories are ones of intersections, sometimes very painful ones, sometimes more inspiring ones. But nonetheless, the history of that republic is of these multiplicity of experiences and recognizing those. But she said for 30 years they've been trying to find out how to connect them, and they can't. And they're still working at it, but they're not getting anywhere. Well, it kind of speaks to the situation we're at here still. Here we've been talking about the struggle of how to bring the reality of these different experiences and their intersections that form what is the collective stories and histories together, and how to recognize those different experiences and histories and how they have intersected, so that children on the bottom of Needham Street on IR1, or on the reserves up and down the peninsula off West Saanich Road, or in Souk, and their peers in the other parts of those areas are not occupying and hearing and living totally different understandings of what each other's experience has been, is, and will be. And that challenge of bringing that to light, the heart of that challenge, the first step in that challenge is to cultivate an ethic of recognition of each other's experience. And that takes painstaking and difficult sacrifice and work. And our speaker this morning, Grand Chief Konrad Sioui, is one of the leaders in bringing to light the reality of that experience so that it can be recognized, and so that intersection of those histories, of those realities and experiences can begin to be felt and heard and understood for generations to come, so that this somewhat Canadian tradition, somehow we sometimes feel out of sight, out of mind, doesn't exist, no problem, that is no longer a tolerable reality. Grand Chief Konrad Sioui brought this work to light in many capacities of his life, as a humanitarian, as a diplomat, as a leader, as a negotiator, as the litigant, the named litigant in the Sioui cases that brought up these treaties from other parts of the country and saw them defended and recognized and affirmed. And out in other parts of the country, he has been doing incredible work. And now in this gathering, we see how the incredible work that's going on here is coming together with the work that he has led for many years. So we're very, very honored to have the Grand Chief with us, and I look very much forward to his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to every one of you. I hope you had a good rest. I did. Feel in a good shape this morning. And again, I want to pay tribute to the organizers, especially to Chief White and his team and all the Douglas Treaty chiefs and the people and everyone around who for many, many years also have put some faith in their rights, in their treaties, and have demonstrated all over that we are not only requesting that these rights be recognized, but also be put into action. So yeah, when you were in Boston, Mr. Chairman, you know, these two roads, parallel roads that don't seem to never intertwine or get together, they represent, according to us in the East, the first treaty that was entered into between the newcomers and the First Nations, and it's called the Two-Row Wampum. It's in fact, we hold it so dearly, this treaty, this wampum belt, that it's on our national flag, you know. Yeah, and because it represents the real essence of the relationship itself, you know. You know, I'm on my canoe, paddling down my river, and my brother is in his boat, in his own river, paddling down the course of life, and we share things that might be good for each other, but we never try to assimilate, never try to bring the other one into our own river or into our own canoe. This is what we call respect. This is what we call to be able to look at each other as brothers and sisters, you know. So the Turo Wampum is what guide. In fact, it's so powerful, this relationship, this image, that the Royal Commission report has made out of the Turo Wampum the main element of its report, the relationship itself, you know. So, without delay, I want to thank you, Chief, and your wife for the beautiful prayer. And here it is. I'm going to read this time. I'm not used to read, but we will talk later on. First of all, there is a myth prevailing among federal and provincial officials, and also, most unfortunately, among First Nations peoples covered by the numbered treaties and perhaps the modern era treaties, that the so-called pre-Confederation treaties with the Crown are lesser instruments. Fortunately for the pre-Confederation treaties peoples, the courts decidedly disagree. In discussing pre-Confederation treaties, I will concentrate on the Mi'kmaq Peace and Friendship treaties of the 1750s, our own treaty, the Huron-British Treaty of 1760, the treaties concluded between the Anishinaabe peoples and the Crown in southern Ontario during the 18th and the early 19th centuries, and the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island. Of course, there was active treaty making between First Nations in the pre-contact era. This activity now appears to be on the rise in recent years. Pre-Confederation treaties not binding on the Crown. Let's start with the misguided, or is it actually an intentional, position of the federal and provincial officials. The Crown early argued, for example, in the Queen versus Simon, a Mi'kmaq case involving the peace and friendship treaties of the 1750s, that treaties which did not involve surrender of territory by First Nations could not be legally binding agreements. Let's consider that for a moment. The Crown's position was that the treaties involving surrender were, of course, binding, certainly on the First Nations, but treaties through which the Crown promised protection, alliance, trade, were not binding on the Crown. In other words, the honor of the Crown was reflected in extinguishing First Nations' title and rights, their attachment to their lands, their dependence on the fruits of the land, but there was no dishonor in repudiating promises of alliance, trade, and protection. Pre-Confederation treaty rights may be easily terminated. Even if a treaty is acknowledged, the Crown suggests that particular rights under pre-Confederation treaties may be easily terminated. In Simon, it was suggested that military hostilities involving the parties to treaty had the effect of extinguishing the treaty rights. Perhaps more disturbing is the Crown's position on my nation's treaty, the Huron-British Treaty of 1760, a treaty of peace concluded with the British in the final days of the French and Indian War. Both the treaty and the rights recognized were confirmed as such by unanimous Supreme Court in Sioui in 1990, 5 days prior to Sparrow. Here, the default position of the Crown is that as the treaty contains no detailed provisions on rights or description of territory covered, it could not be implemented. The Supreme Court again found a just solution in Sioui. The court held that given the guarantee to the Hurons of their customs and religion as well as free trade with the British, it was reasonable to assume that the treaty applied throughout the territory frequented by the Hurons in 1760. But the Crown was not quite ready to seek reconciliation as required by the courts, for example in Mikisew or Haida. Not until absolutely forced to do so. And so, now it puts the Hurons to the strict proof of exactly which portion of the Huron-Sioui, our traditional territory, were frequented in 1760, despite the testimony of the family heads, chiefs, the elderly, and the hunters, and the descriptions of the 18th century writers on Huron society, territory, and activities like Charlevoix, La Hontan, etc., not to mention the preeminent ethno-historian, the late Bruce Trigger. And so for the past number of months, and probably for months to come, our researchers are interrogated by the federal and provincial counterparts and required to provide 18 documentation to establish Huron use and occupation of our historic territory. Does this happen in the case of the numbered treaties, despite there being no specific description in the treaties of the territories of each band signing the treaties? Of course not. And the modern era treaties, what people have been put to the strict proof of their frequentation of the treaty territory? There is an explanation, of course. Ironically, unlike the pre-Confederation treaties that involved no surrender or covenants not to exercise certain rights, the numbered treaties and the modern era treaties have been considered as instruments for obtaining surrender, obtaining certainty, or freeing the land of its resources of the burden of Aboriginal rights and title. Is it any wonder that the Crown sets up these treaties against those concluded before Confederation? Remember Sioui. These pre-Confederation treaties were where the Crown derived benefits from the First Nations, not through surrender or extinguishment, but through military alliances and trading alliances, as a result of which the Crown was and remains historically beholden to the First Nations. It is awkward to betray an ally that has helped you get where you are, to use force against allies and friends who have helped you attain the power you now wish to use against them. Better to simply deny any binding commitments in first place. The courts have recognized these aspects of the pre-Confederation treaty relationship, and in certain limited cases in the numbered treaties, like in Badger. In Simon, Chief Justice Dixon observed, the treaty was entered into for the benefit of the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq people to maintain peace and order, as well as to recognize and confirm the existing hunting and fishing rights of the Mi'kmaqs. In Marshall 1, Justice Binney described the mutual self-interest of the British and Mi'kmaq in establishing a stable peace. It should be pointed out that the Mi'kmaq were a considerable fighting force in the 18th century. Not only were the raiding parties effective on land, Mi'kmaq were accomplished sailors. The Mi'kmaq, according to evidence, had seized in the order of 100 European sailing vessels in the years prior to 1760. There are recorded Mi'kmaq sailings in the 18th century between Nova Scotia, Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, and Newfoundland. They were not people to be trifled with. However, by 1760, the British and the Mi'kmaq had a mutual self-interest in terminating hostilities and establishing the basis for a stable peace. In Sioui, at the Supreme Court, it was decided on the evidence before the court, some of which was brought in for the first time at the Supreme Court level by the Intervenor Assembly of First Nations, that the British desperately regarded alliance with First Nations as essential to defeat the French in the French and Indian War. Justice Lemaire wrote, "The mother countries did everything in their power to secure the alliance of each Indian nation and to encourage nation allies allied with the enemy to change sides. When these efforts met with success, they were incorporated in treaties of alliance and or neutrality. This clearly indicates that the Indian nations were regarded in their relations with the European nations which occupied North America as independent nations. Further, both the French and the English recognized the critical importance of alliances with the Indians, or at least their neutrality, in determining the outcome of the war between them and the security of the North American colonies. In the important case of the Queen versus White and Bob addressing the status of the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island, Justice Norris was quite clear as to the role of treaties generally and the Douglas Treaties in particular in achieving alliances with the surrounding Indian nations with a view to ensuring the security of the colonists. In one well-known passage, he writes, in the section 87 of the Indian Act, treaty is not a word of art. And in my respectful opinion, it embraces all such engagements made by persons in authority as may be brought within the term, the word of the white man, the sanctity of which was, at the time of British exploration and settlement, the most important means of obtaining the goodwill and cooperation of the native tribes and ensuring that the colonists would be protected from death and destruction. Further, in his judgment, Justice Norris points out how, at the time of Douglas, it was particularly important for the maintenance of law and order that Indian rights be respected and interpreted broadly in favor of the Indians, not merely for the due administration of law, but also for the safety of the settlers who constituted a minority of, at the most, 1,000 persons, there being 30,000 Indians on Vancouver Island alone, apart from the warlike tribes to the north who always constituted a raiding threat and against whom the maintenance of friendship with the local Indians afforded a measure of security. Capacity to sign treaties and the Federal Crown's unique responsibility in the implementation of the pre-Confederation treaties. Returning to the East Coast and the consideration by the Supreme Court of Canada in Simon of the Treaty of 1752, Chief Justice Dixon reveals that the Crown questioned the capacity of the parties to that treaty to conclude the treaty and explained that the issue of capacity was raised for the purpose of illustrating that the Treaty of 1752 was of a lesser status than an international treaty and therefore was more easily terminated. The Crown also referred the court the decision of acting Judge Patterson in the Queen versus Silly Boy in 1929. This judgment is notorious and rightly so, given the manner in which acting Judge Patterson described the Indian parties to the 1752 treaty. You may remember the gist of his remarks. Treaties are unconstrained acts of independent powers. But the Indians were never regarded as an independent power. A civilized nation first discovering a country of uncivilized people or savages held such country as its own until such time as by treaty it was transferred to some other civilized nation. The savages' rights of sovereignty, even of ownership, were never recognized. Nova Scotia had passed to Great Britain not by gift or purchase from or even by conquest of the Indians, but by treaty with France, which had acquired it by priority of discovery and ancient possession, and the Indians passed with it. The Chief Justice in Simon criticized the language of Judge Patterson, remarking that it reflects the biases and prejudices of another era in our history. Such language is no longer accepted in Canadian law, and indeed is inconsistent with growing sensitivity to native rights in Canada. The Chief Justice found both the Micmac and Governor Hobson possessed the full capacity to enter into a binding treaty on behalf of their people. The issue of capacity arose again with our treaty, the Huron-British Treaty of 1760, and settled in the Supreme Court of Canada. The Crown raised questions as to the capacity of General Murray to conclude a binding treaty on behalf of the Great Britain. With respect to the capacity of the Hurons, the Crown and Sioui attempt to argue that the Hurons could not enter into treaty with the British Crown because this Indian nation, had no historical occupation or possession of the territory extending from the St. Maurice to the Saguenay rivers. Not going as far as it did in Simon, the Crown nevertheless argued that a treaty could not confer rights on the Indians unless they could claim historical occupation or possession of the lands in question. Justice Lamer rejected these arguments, stating, "There is no basis either in precedent or in ordinary meaning of the word treaty for imposing such a restriction on what can constitute a treaty within the section of 88 of the Indian Act." In Simon, this court in fact rejected that argument that Section 88 applied only to land cession treaties. In the court's opinion, that would limit severely the scope of the word treaty and run contrary to the principle that Indian treaties should be liberally construed and uncertainties resolved in favor of the Indians. The argument made here must be rejected in the same way. There is no reason why an agreement concerning something other than a territory, such as an agreement about political or social rights, cannot be a treaty within the meaning of the Section 88 of the Indian Act. There is also no basis for excluding agreements in which the Crown may have chosen to create, for the benefit of a tribe, rights over territory other than its traditional territory. Accordingly, I consider that the territorial claim is not essential to the existence of a treaty. And so what comes out of these two cases, Simon and Sioui, is that the Indian nations are not only perceived as possessors of land to which the Crown needs access, but also as independent nations with wide-ranging jurisdiction with whom the Crown needed to conclude treaties for purposes of its own security and that of its subjects. This opens up very interesting windows on the breadth of meaning and interpretation of the pre-Confederation treaties, not bounded by defined territory or circumscribed by the nature of the pre-existing territorial rights of the First Nations signatories. Returning to the West Coast, in White and Bob, the debate again was over capacity to sign a treaty. This time, whether the Hudson's Bay Company, through James Douglas, had capacity to conclude a treaty within the meaning of Section 87 of the Indian Act. The answer given by Justice Norris is interesting, as it shows the flexibility inherent in these pre-Confederation treaties. Justice Norris stated, "I have no doubt that in enacting Section 87 of the Indian Act, Parliament recognized the fact that Indian treaties would have been completed in degrees of formality varying with the circumstances of each case, some with government representatives, some with military commanders, and other with frontier representatives of the great trading companies. It was necessary that those on the frontier be given wide powers and wide discretion." So it was with Douglas. Justice Lamer and Sioui, dealing with the same question as to whether the 1760 document was a treaty, referred to Justice Norris in White and Bob, stressing the lack of formality and flexibility required in the face of these early treaties. Justice Lamer quotes Norris as follows, "The question is, in my respectful opinion, to be resolved not by the application of rigid rules of construction without regard to the circumstances existing when the document was completed, nor by the test of modern-day draftsmanship. In determining what the intention of Parliament was at the time of the enactment of Section 87, now 88, of the Indian Act, Parliament is to be taken to have had in mind the common understanding of the parties to the document at the time it was executed. Justice Lemaire also refers to Chief Justice in Simon and concludes, in our quest for the legal nature of the document of the September 5th, 1760, therefore, we should adopt a broad and generous interpretation of what constitutes a treaty. In all this, of course, there is no place for the provinces. They did not exist. The treaty arrangements were concluded by the imperial crown and inherited by the federal crown after Confederation. That is why, in the case of our treaty, when the time came to establish a table for discussions with government, we insisted that discussions or negotiations must commence on a bilateral basis between the Huron nation and the federal crown, and that is in fact what occurred. Although it was agreed that the province could be later invited to join the talks, our perspective is that it is the federal crown that is responsible for the implementation of our treaty and therefore responsible for the actions of the province of Quebec. The cultural and historical context. In a case presently before the federal court brought by the Chippewa and Mississauga First Nations who signed the 1923 Williams Treaties in southern Ontario, those nations explain how, prior to Confederation, they had an extensive experience of treaty making with the Crown. They entered into treaties relations with the Crown through the Niagara Treaty of 1759, the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, the Collins Treaty of 1785, the Crawford Purchase of 1784, the Between the Lakes Treaty of 1784, the Gunshot Treaty of 1788, the Penetanguishene Treaty number 5 of 1798, Treaty number 16 of 1815, Treaty number 17 of 1816, Treaty number 18, the Wasaga Treaty of 1818, Treaty number 20, Rice Lake Treaty of 1818, and Treaty number 7 of 1822, by which they established military and trade alliances and reserved hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering rights and sites of importance for those activities. These people had a consistent treaty strategy in concluding the pre-Confederation treaties, in which they negotiated their reservation of all points of land, rivers, and islands, along with their fish and wildlife populations. That is to say, the parts of the territory most important for their harvesting activities. The judgment of the Court of Appeal of Ontario in Taylor and William, dealing with the 1818 Rice Lake Treaty, is one of the first and more important pronouncements by the courts on how early treaties should be looked upon and interpreted. Associate Chief Justice Meckin says some important things in that judgment, one of them being the following. Cases on Indian or Aboriginal rights can never be determined in a vacuum. It is of importance to consider the history and oral traditions of the tribes concerned and the surrounding circumstances at the time of the treaty, relied on by both parties in determining the treaty's effects. Although it is not possible to remedy all of what we now perceive as past wrongs in view of the passage of time, nevertheless, it is essential and in keeping with established and accepted principles that the courts not create, by a remote, isolated current view of the past, new grievances. In Taylor and Williams, the court looked beyond the text of the treaty to examine the conferences that took place between Indian tribes and the Crown negotiator William Claus. It was through these conferences that the court could decide that the Indian tribes had reserved their harvesting rights and places. Of course, the courts are now recognizing, even in the case of the numbered treaties, that the conferences held between the Crown's negotiator and the First Nations were important, and in some cases determined the meaning of the written treaty. But let us remember that this approach started with a case dealing with the pre-Confederation treaties in Taylor and Williams. Unfortunately, the modern era treaties now contain provisions that the written text is the entire agreement between the parties. This has proved to be a disadvantage. the historical and cultural context of treaties are extremely important. And we, with pre-Confederation treaties, enjoyed that advantage. This was certainly the case of our nation in how the Supreme Court of Canada and Sioui understood our 1760 Treaty of Peace, as I have described earlier. Now, pre-Confederation treaties in the 21st century, none of us should apologize for our pre-Confederation treaties. On the contrary, we should be proud that they represent the first and most authentic face of Crown First Nations treaty making in Canada. If indeed governments or others say that they are difficult to implement because they're broad terms, I would urge you all not to give up into pressure to replace your treaties. Finally, let me explain the approach that my nation, the Huron-Wendat nation, has adopted. We propose that our nation and governments attempt to come to terms on texts that would express the common understanding between our nation and Canada and the province as to what the terms of our 1760 Treaty meant in the 18th century, in its spirit and intent, when it was concluded, and how those terms may be translated for the 21st century. These texts would not replace the original treaty, but would become part of it, probably in the form of a schedule or an annex. This way, the original undertakings in the original language are preserved. The parties may proceed to implement them in the 21st century according to their spirit and intent as set out in the schedule or annex of the 1760 Treaty. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Grand Chief. Really laid out the essential legal lineage around the pre-Confederation treaties across the country, and brings out how the work that's been done in the courts, such as in White and Bob, like we heard last night, the work you yourself has done, how that is all laying to a common context across the country for implementation of these treaties. But you also hinted at something very important, because you stressed how the pre-Confederation treaties have an inherent flexibility. And that is completely at odds with what there is almost a fetishistic attachment to in contemporary treaty processes, which is the term certainty. You cannot get through a meeting without Crown actors, without certainty being pleaded for. But I ask you, if any of you has a relationship in your life that's characterized by certainty, it is an impossibility. It is trying to take something that's inherently dynamic and fit it into a constrained box. Certainty in the modern treaty-making context almost speaks to connoting, can we agree how we do not have to talk together anymore, rather than the actual inherent purpose of them, which is to guide us in how we continue to have our expansive and creative discussions. So thank you for bringing that point out, and I'll ask Chief White to come and present a gift. And Ralph.
Grand Chief Sioui, on behalf of the University and the Nanaimo First Nation and everyone that's gathered here today, we really want to express our deepest gratitude for the distance that you've traveled, both from across the country, but also through your life in terms of advancing and working in the issues for Canadian society to make it whole again. This is a small gift, an expression of our gratitude for you to bring home. So thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.